When Yvonne, a mother on the brink, sacrifices everything for her sick daughter, fate brings her to Penley, a man who knows struggle all too well. In their fight to survive, small acts of kindness spark life-changing turns. Before we begin, comment your rating from 0 to 10 and share where you're listening from. Enjoy. Yvonne Carter could feel her heartbeat pounding against her chest as she stepped into the conference room. Her blonde hair, damp from the storm outside, clung to her cheeks. But it wasn't the rain that made her shiver. It was the weight of the decision she had made. In her arms, her 6-year-old daughter, Lila, nestled quietly, her face pale with fever, her small body burning with heat. Yvonne had no choice but to bring her to work. She had no one else to look after her. The daycare was closed, and taking another day off wasn't an option. She had already missed too many shifts, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. The soft, wheezing sound of Lila's breath in her arms reminded Yvonne just how fragile her little girl was. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp voice of Clarissa, her manager. "Why is your son here, Yvonne? This is a workplace, not a daycare." Yvonne's heart sank as all eyes turned toward her. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched Lila a little closer, the child's feverish head now resting against her chest. Yvonne's voice, though shaky, was firm as she replied, "She's sick, Clarissa. I didn't have a choice. I had no one else to turn to." The room fell silent, the tension thick as everyone waited for Clarissa's response. Yvonne could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. Clarissa's expression remained unreadable, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Company policy is clear," she said, her voice steely. "No children allowed on the premises. This is unacceptable." Yvonne's heart skipped a beat as Clarissa's words rang in her ears. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but it was no use. Every instinct inside her screamed to explain, to plead for understanding, but the words wouldn't come. She glanced around at her colleagues, hoping someone would speak up, hoping someone would show her some sign of support. But they all looked away, avoiding her gaze as if they were afraid to get involved. Yvonne felt her throat tighten, and the weight of the situation crushed her chest. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her job, not when she had worked so hard to get here. She needed this paycheck. She needed this stability. Clarissa turned her back on her, signaling the end of the conversation. Yvonne could barely hear her own breath as the room seemed to close in around her. "You're terminated, effective immediately." Clarissa's voice cut through the stillness, cold and final. Yvonne stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the words, unable to move. The shock hit her like a physical blow, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The room was silent, and all she could hear was the distant hum of the overhead lights. Without another word, Yvonne gathered her strength and turned away. Her legs trembled as she carried Lila out of the room, the weight of the child in her arms grounding her in the moment. She stepped out into the hallway, the cold air from the open door sending a shiver down her spine. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her back, their gazes heavy with judgment, their silence louder than any words they could have said. The rain had stopped outside, but Yvonne felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she stepped into the gray, drizzling afternoon. Her jacket clung to her body, soaked through as she wrapped it tightly around Lila to shield her from the cold. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back to that office, to that cruel dismissal. Her mind raced as she walked through the empty streets, her thoughts scattered and frantic. "I just need to finish my shift," she whispered softly to Lila, her voice breaking. "We'll figure this out. I promise." But the words felt hollow, empty, because deep down, Yvonne knew she had no plan, no way out. The world around her kept moving, people hurrying by with umbrellas, their heads down, their faces shielded from the rain. No one stopped to help. No one even noticed her. She felt invisible. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last, as if the weight of her failure was pulling her down. The streets were slick with rain, and her shoes made soft slapping noises as she walked, but the sound barely reached her ears. Lila coughed softly, and Yvonne tightened her grip on her daughter. She had nothing left, no job, no car, and no one to call. The bills were piling up, and now her job, her only source of income, was gone. She had no idea what to do next. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to give up. Not for Lila. She couldn't. Yvonne's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. The battery was low anyway, and she didn't have the strength to deal with anything else right now. She passed a brightly lit cafe, the warmth from the windows spilling out onto the cold pavement. The laughter and chatter from inside reached her ears, and for a brief moment, she thought about walking in, asking for help, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She kept walking, her mind focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The world was moving on without her, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had to keep going for Lila. She had to find a way out of this mess, no matter how impossible it seemed. At the street corner, Yvonne paused, her breath shallow, Lila's feverish body pressed close to hers. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering words of comfort, though she wasn't sure she believed them herself. "We're going to be okay. Mama's not giving up." And in that moment, she meant it. She wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. She had to keep going. And somewhere, deep down, Yvonne knew that somehow, some way, things would change. She just had to keep fighting. She had to keep walking. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of desperation and rejection. Yvonne had barely slept since the day she lost her job, and now she found herself walking the same streets day after day, looking for anything, any opportunity, that might save her from drowning in the mounting pressure. The rain had finally stopped, but the weight in her chest, the constant, suffocating feeling of failure hadn't lifted. She didn't have the luxury of time or peace to let her heart heal. Lila needed her, and every moment of inaction felt like a betrayal of the tiny, fragile life in her arms. Yvonne passed by the same corner store again, the one where she had tried to apply for a job the day before. The door jangled with the sound of the bell as she walked in, the familiar smell of fresh bread and cleaning products, a constant reminder of her helplessness. She walked up to the counter and stood there for a long moment, waiting for the employee behind it to acknowledge her. But no one did. The clerk was too busy chatting with a regular customer, and his head turned away. Yvonne's stomach twisted in frustration. "Excuse me," she said softly, but the words fell flat, as if the world was telling her she wasn't worth anyone's time. The clerk looked at her with a forced smile and an expression that said she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat. She swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. "I was here yesterday. I wanted to apply for the job." His eyes flicked to the register, then back to her, and then, as if he had already made up his mind, he shook his head. "We're not hiring, sorry." Yvonne nodded, trying to hide the sting of his dismissal, but it was like a blow to the chest. She turned away without another word and walked out of the store. Another door slammed shut, another rejection. She could feel her resolve weakening with each passing day, but she couldn't afford to break. Not now. Not when Lila was counting on her. The wind was picking up again, cold and biting, and Yvonne wrapped her jacket tighter around herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope, to wish it was someone offering a glimmer of help, a solution to her mounting troubles. But when she checked the screen, the message was just another bill reminder, one more thing she couldn't afford to pay. With a sigh, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned toward the alley behind the convenience store. She had already walked past this area dozens of times, but today she felt an odd pull. As she ventured down the narrow, litter-filled alley, she spotted an older woman standing beside a small cart, pulling out a stack of cleaning supplies from the back. The woman was hunched, her face weathered with years of hard work, but she smiled warmly when she saw Yvonne. "Hey there!" the woman called out, wiping her hands on a rag. "You look like you've had a rough day. You need something to eat." Yvonne shook her head, grateful for the kindness, but embarrassed by her inability to accept charity. "I'm fine, thank you." "You sure?" the woman pressed, her eyes searching Yvonne's face. "You look like you've been walking all day." Yvonne couldn't deny it. She hadn't stopped since the morning, not for food or rest. She stopped, unsure of how to explain the weight pressing down on her. "I'm looking for work, but no one seems to want me." The woman's expression softened, and she took a step closer, her eyes scanning Yvonne's face as if she saw the hidden exhaustion in her eyes. "I know how it feels, dear," she said quietly, her voice low and knowing. "I've been there. Lost everything once. But you don't give up. Not ever." Yvonne felt something shift inside her, a flicker of hope, like a tiny flame starting to spark. She needed that. She needed someone to tell her it was going to be okay, even if it wasn't. "Do you know of any jobs?" Yvonne asked, her voice barely above a whisper, like asking was a form of surrender. "Anything. I can clean, I can do anything." The woman thought for a moment before nodding slowly. "I know a place that's hiring. It's not much, but it'll keep you afloat. It's a cleaning job for a company that takes care of office buildings. They don't ask too many questions and they pay cash." Yvonne's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. "I'll take it," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Where do I go?" The woman handed her a small, wrinkled flyer. "They're looking for people. Go there tomorrow. Don't waste time." Yvonne nodded, holding the flyer tightly, as if it were the only thing standing between her and falling into an abyss. She thanked the woman, who gave her a sympathetic smile, and continued down the alley toward the bus stop. The wind had picked up again, but this time, Yvonne didn't feel quite so cold. The next day, Yvonne stood in front of a gray brick building, the address on the flyer in her hand. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. She felt a tight knot form in her stomach as she stepped inside, the scent of lemon-scented cleaning supplies, mixing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She signed in at the front desk, her hands trembling as she filled out the application. When she reached the question about being fired, her pen hovered over the box, and for a moment, she considered lying. But the truth weighed too heavily on her. She checked yes and waited for the inevitable rejection. As she handed the form back, a man entered the lobby, holding a set of keys. His dark jeans were worn, and his white button-up shirt was rolled up at the sleeves. Yvonne looked up at him, and their eyes met for the briefest moment, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Then he was gone, disappearing down the hall, but not before Yvonne caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a shared understanding, perhaps. The receptionist called her name a moment later, and before she could even process it, Yvonne was being handed a uniform and told she could start the next day. As she left the building, she glanced at the street, the wind picking up again. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope, as if maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. The next morning, Yvonne woke up to the sound of Lila's soft coughs, her tiny body still feverish despite the few hours of restless sleep. She kissed her daughter's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from her skin, and for a moment, just a fleeting second, Yvonne wished she could curl up and forget about the world. But she couldn't. Not today. She had a job interview, a rare chance at something stable, something that could keep them afloat. As she quickly dressed, her thoughts kept drifting back to the flyer, the small piece of paper that seemed to hold her only hope. The building she had visited yesterday was nothing like the sleek offices she'd imagined. It stood in stark contrast to the polished, high-rise buildings Yvonne had once dreamed of working in. It was old, its gray bricks weathered and chipped, a stark reminder of the kinds of jobs she now found herself seeking. She couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment as she entered the building's dreary lobby, where the fluorescent lights hummed in a dull, relentless rhythm. She signed in at the front desk, her hands clammy as she nervously awaited instructions. Her nerves spiked when the receptionist handed her a standard janitor's uniform. It was as if she were back in high school, wearing the same drab attire. But this time it wasn't for a school job. This was real life. She was taken to the back of the building, where a dimly lit hallway stretched out in front of her. And as she walked, Yvonne felt the weight of the uniform settling on her shoulders, heavier than it should have been. The building smelled of stale air and industrial cleaning supplies, a sharp contrast to the fresh, vibrant office spaces she had once envisioned working in. The hallway seemed endless as she followed the janitorial supervisor, Elena, down narrow corridors lined with offices. Yvonne tried to steady her breathing, but the anxiety gnawed at her. She kept telling herself that this was a fresh start, a small step, but the doubt was persistent, whispering in her ear like a shadow she couldn't shake. As she was shown the cleaning supplies room and given instructions on what she would be doing, Yvonne couldn't ignore the feeling that she didn't belong here, not in this gray world of fluorescent lights and chipped paint. "You'll start today, cleaning the office areas and the restrooms," Elena said, her voice unremarkable, as though she had said it 1,000 times. Yvonne nodded, trying to mask the sting of her insecurities. "And you can take your daughter with you, as long as she stays in the break room," Elena added, giving Yvonne a soft, almost compassionate smile. It was the first kind gesture she had received in days. For a moment, the weight of everything lifted, if only slightly. Yvonne let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She could do this. For Lila. She would do anything for Lila. The break room was small and sparse, just a few tables and a small TV in the corner. When she placed Lila down on the couch, she saw the girl's tired eyes, fluttering closed, her small hand clutching her worn-out stuffed animal. Yvonne kissed her forehead again before heading into the office areas to begin her work. The building wasn't what she had imagined, but she didn't care, not anymore. This was a job, and it was the only chance she had right now to take care of her daughter. Hours passed, and the monotony of cleaning began to feel more like a comforting routine than a chore. Yvonne lost herself in the rhythm of wiping down countertops, scrubbing floors, and emptying trash bins. She felt the exhaustion creeping in, but there was a strange satisfaction in the work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. It was a way to provide, to keep her and Lila from sinking deeper into the mess they had found themselves in. When the clock hit noon, Yvonne took a break to check on Lila. Her daughter was still asleep, curled up on the couch, her breathing slow and steady. Yvonne smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. Just as she was about to return to her cleaning duties, a man walked into the break room. He was tall, with dark jeans and a crisp white shirt that was slightly rumpled at the sleeves. Yvonne barely noticed him at first, too caught up in the quiet of the room. But when he glanced her way, she saw something in his expression. A flash of recognition, a flicker of something familiar. He stopped just short of the counter, his eyes lingering on her, and then on Lila, still asleep on the couch. There was something in his gaze that made her feel uneasy, as if he could see right through her, as if he knew exactly who she was and where she had been. "Is everything okay?" the man asked, his voice low and steady. Yvonne was taken aback by the question. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied, her voice betraying her anxiety. The man nodded but didn't move. His gaze shifted between Yvonne and Lila again, as if something about the scene had caught his attention. There was an odd, almost unspoken connection between them in that brief moment, and it made Yvonne uncomfortable. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he just offered a polite nod before walking out of the break room, disappearing down the hallway. Yvonne tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in her chest. She couldn't dwell on it. She had a job to do. But as she returned to her work, she couldn't help but wonder who that man was. Over the next few days, Yvonne continued to clean the building, moving from room to room in a haze of exhaustion. She was learning the ropes, figuring out where the supplies were kept, and how to make the work go faster. Now and then, she would glance toward the break room, where Lila slept or drew quietly, her little body still weak, but slowly getting better. Every moment Yvonne spent in this building reminded her of just how far she had fallen. But with every chore, every sweep of the mop, every corner wiped clean, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in months: control. She had a purpose again, and yet there was something in the air that made her uneasy. The man, one from the break room, kept showing up in her thoughts. She couldn't explain it, but every time he passed by, his gaze seemed to linger longer than necessary. He never spoke to her again, but she caught him looking at her on several occasions, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. But she couldn't afford to think about him. Not now. Not when she had her daughter to care for. As the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. Yvonne found herself getting more comfortable in the routine of the work. It was exhausting, physically taxing, and at times disheartening. But it was a job. And that was something she desperately needed. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that the man, the one who had looked at her with such intensity, was somehow watching over her, quietly intervening in ways she couldn't yet understand. The quiet moments became harder to ignore, and Yvonne realized that this job, new life, might just hold more than she had initially thought. The first few days of her new job felt like a blur, each hour a blur of dust and cleaning chemicals. But Yvonne kept going. The weight of exhaustion bore down on her with each passing hour, but it was the relentless fear of failure that kept her from stopping. Lila's health seemed to improve slowly, but she was still fragile, and every cough made Yvonne's heart race. As she mopped the same floors again and again, her thoughts wandered back to the days before, when she had hoped for something better, when she had dreamed of a future where she could provide her daughter with more than just survival. But now, that seemed like a distant memory, and all she could focus on was getting through each day. Yvonne found herself waking up early each morning, exhausted before the day even began. She had to prepare herself for the constant cycle of cleaning, checking on Lila, and then repeating the process. Her body ached, her muscles burned, and there were moments when her hands trembled from the effort. Her back, stiff from hours of bending over, seemed to cry out in protest with every movement. But she didn't have time to rest. Lila was counting on her, and Yvonne couldn't let her down. One morning, as she walked into the break room to check on Lila, she was struck by the sight of her daughter, sitting up on the couch, her sketchbook open, a bright smile on her face. It was the first real smile Yvonne had seen in weeks. The lines of worry on Lila's face had softened, and the fever that had kept her in a near-constant state of rest seemed to be gone. Her little fingers were moving furiously over the page, sketching something Yvonne couldn't quite see, but the energy in her daughter's movements gave her a fleeting sense of hope. Maybe things were getting better. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. Yvonne crouched down beside the couch, brushing a lock of hair from Lila's forehead. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, trying to hide the exhaustion that she knew must show on her face. Lila looked up, her eyes wide with excitement. "I feel better, Mama. Look," she said, holding up the sketchbook to reveal a series of stick figures, each one wearing a superhero cape. Yvonne smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're getting better, huh?" Yvonne said softly, brushing a tear from her eye before it could fall. Lila nodded enthusiastically. "I'm going to draw you, Mama, like a superhero," she declared, her voice full of determination. Yvonne chuckled, though it was bittersweet. "You already have, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You already have." But just as quickly as the moment of joy came, it was replaced with the cold reality of the day ahead. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound a constant reminder of how little time Yvonne had. She had to finish her shift. She had to keep moving. The small victories, like Lila's smile, were fleeting, but they kept her going. As the day wore on, Yvonne moved from office to office, the same cleaning routine taking over. She swept the floors, wiped down counters, and scrubbed toilets until her hands were raw. The familiar ache in her back grew stronger with every step, but she pushed through it, her body running on sheer willpower. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was what she had, and that had to be enough. At lunchtime, Yvonne grabbed a quick bite in the break room, but her mind wasn't on the food. She was tired, so tired. She hadn't slept well the night before, her mind racing with worry about Lila's health and the bills piling up. Each day felt like a battle she had to fight just to survive. But as she ate, the door to the break room opened, and there he was again, the man from the other day, Penley. This time, he didn't walk past without acknowledging her. He stopped just inside the doorway, glancing toward her with a look that was hard to read. "How's she doing?" he asked, his voice gentle, but there was something in his eyes that made Yvonne feel like he wasn't just asking about Lila's health. Yvonne glanced at her daughter, still sitting on the couch, her head bent over her sketchbook. "She's better," Yvonne said, offering a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for asking." Penley nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I just wanted to check in. Let me know if you need anything," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that caught Yvonne off guard. She nodded, though she didn't quite know how to respond. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, kindness without strings attached. "I appreciate it," she said quietly. With a brief nod, Penley turned and walked out of the room, leaving Yvonne standing there, her thoughts a tangled mess. She couldn't quite explain why his presence unsettled her, but she couldn't ignore the fact that there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel both seen and vulnerable at the same time. But she pushed the thought aside. She didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a job to do. The rest of the day passed in a haze of exhaustion. Yvonne's muscles screamed for rest, but she kept moving. The hours dragged on, each one longer than the last, and by the time she finished her shift, her body felt as if it might collapse under the weight of her own fatigue. But when she walked into the break room to check on Lila, she was surprised to see her daughter still awake, her eyes bright with excitement. "I finished it, Mama," Lila exclaimed, holding up her sketchbook. Yvonne sat down beside her, her tiredness momentarily forgotten. "Let me see," she said, her voice full of warmth. Lila handed her the sketchbook, and Yvonne flipped through the pages, each one filled with drawings of superheroes, each one more colorful and detailed than the last. But it was the last page that caught her attention. It was a drawing of herself, standing tall, her arms outstretched, as if she were ready to take on the world. Yvonne smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You really see me, don't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lila nodded, her face lighting up with the joy only a child could know. "You're my superhero, Mama," she said softly. Yvonne kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart full. "And you're mine, sweetie," she replied. "You're mine." For a brief moment, everything felt okay. The exhaustion, the pain, the struggle. It all faded away as Yvonne held her daughter in her arms. She had nothing left but Lila, and for the first time in a long time, Yvonne realized that might just be enough. But even as the warmth of that moment enveloped her, she knew the road ahead would be long and hard. The journey was far from over. But as long as she had Lila by her side, Yvonne would never stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. The days had settled into a grueling rhythm, each one blending seamlessly into the next. Yvonne's body ached with exhaustion, but she didn't let it slow her down. Lila's health had improved, though her recovery was slow, and the strain of keeping up with her daughter's needs, along with the physical demands of the job, weighed heavily on Yvonne's shoulders. Each day was a struggle to balance her responsibilities, and even the brief moments of joy, Lila's bright smiles and laughter, were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the harsh reality of their situation. But there was something different in the air now, something subtle that Yvonne couldn't quite place. It started with the small things. A cup of coffee was placed on the counter when she arrived at work one morning, and the extra cleaning supplies she found stocked in the supply closet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Yvonne stop and wonder. Was someone looking out for her? At first, she brushed off the thought as a coincidence, but as the days went on, the small gestures became more frequent. Now and then, there would be a new box of cleaning supplies or a sandwich left on the break room table for her. The kindness, though quiet and anonymous, began to feel like a lifeline, something to cling to when everything else seemed so uncertain. Yvonne didn't know who was behind it. She hadn't asked anyone for help. She didn't need to, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching her, noticing the weight she was carrying, even when she tried to hide it. It was only when she saw him again, Penley, that the pieces started to fall into place. It was late one evening when she was finishing up her shift. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of her mop swishing across the floor, the only noise in the building. Yvonne's legs were sore, her back stiff from hours of bending and scrubbing. But she pushed through it. She was almost done, and all she could think about was getting back to Lila. As she turned the corner toward the hallway that led to the break room, she nearly collided with Penley, who was standing by the door, watching her with a contemplative expression. "Hey," he said, his voice low and almost gentle, as though he wasn't sure whether he should be there. Yvonne stopped in her tracks, her mop in hand. She hadn't expected to see him, and the suddenness of his presence startled her. "You're still working?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face as if looking for something she didn't want to reveal. "I'm almost done," she replied, her voice tired but steady. She didn't know what to say to him. It had been weeks since their last brief interaction, and now he seemed different, closer somehow, as if he had become part of the scenery of her daily life. But she didn't know how to feel about it. She couldn't afford distractions. Penley stepped forward, his eyes flicking to the mop she held in her hand, then back to her. "You should take a break," he said, his voice softer now. "You've been at it all day. You're working too hard." Yvonne looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. "I have to," she said quietly, her words thick with exhaustion. "I need this job. I need to make sure she's okay." She didn't need to say who she was. Penley knew. For a moment, there was silence between them. Yvonne could feel the weight of the words unsaid hanging in the air, thick and heavy. Then Penley moved slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've seen you working. I know what you're going through," he said, his voice steady, though there was something raw in it that made Yvonne's heart skip a beat. "And I just want you to know, you're not alone in this." Yvonne blinked, the quiet sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. She had never really thought about it before, but suddenly, the idea that someone saw her, really saw her, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. She had spent so long carrying the weight of everything on her own, never once letting anyone in, never asking for help. But Penley's words felt different. They felt like a crack in the armor she had built around herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words more for herself than for him. She wasn't sure why she was thanking him, maybe for the kindness, for the brief moment of recognition, maybe for the hope that there was someone out there who understood. Penley nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into the shadows of the building. Yvonne stood there, her mop still in hand, her thoughts spinning. She didn't know what to make of the encounter, or him. But somehow, something inside her had shifted. Over the next few days, the small acts of kindness continued. Extra snacks appeared in the break room, and once, Yvonne found a small envelope on her cleaning cart with a note that simply read, "Take care of yourself." There was no signature, no clue as to who had left it, but it made her feel like someone cared. It made her feel like she wasn't invisible. But as time went on, Yvonne began to notice something else. Whenever Penley was around, his gaze always seemed to linger on her a little longer than it should. He never said much, but his presence was undeniable. He started showing up at odd times, not just when she was working, but when she was resting, when she was talking to Lila in the break room. It wasn't just kindness anymore. It was something else, something unspoken, that hung between them like a thread, connecting their lives in ways she couldn't yet understand. One evening, as Yvonne was cleaning the break room, she found herself staring at the stack of cleaning supplies that had been delivered earlier that day. The box was slightly opened, and inside, nestled among the bottles and rags, was a small toy, a stuffed lion, Lila's favorite. Yvonne's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was the same toy she had seen Lila hugging one night when she had been too sick to sleep. But how? Who? Her heart raced as she stared at the small, worn lion, its fur frayed at the edges. She picked it up, holding it for a moment, before her thoughts turned back to Penley. Was he the one who had left it? Was he the one who had been quietly watching her all this time, offering her help without asking for anything in return? But she didn't have time to think about it. She couldn't afford to. She had a job to do. She had a daughter to care for. The world might be full of people who ignored her, but she had one person who needed her, and that was enough to keep going. As she turned to leave the break room, she glanced one last time at the toy lion, a small symbol of hope amidst the hardship. The world around her might have been falling apart, but in this moment, she wasn't alone. Not anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Yvonne allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The heavy rainfall came as no surprise. It had been threatening to pour all day, dark clouds gathering in the sky like a warning. But even with the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, Yvonne couldn't focus on anything but the exhaustion settling into her bones. The day had dragged on, each moment feeling heavier than the last, and the thought of returning to her tiny apartment with Lila's fever rising again gnawed at her. It was the same every night. Clean, check on Lila, then sleep for only a few hours before repeating the cycle. The rain outside couldn't wash away the fatigue that clung to her like a second skin. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up, but she had no choice. The bills kept coming. Lila needed her medicine, and, most importantly, she needed to keep moving forward. As the day came to a close and the building emptied out, Yvonne made her way toward the break room, her mop dragging behind her as she walked. She paused at the door for a moment, glancing inside, but stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Penley standing there. His gaze turned toward the window. He didn't hear her approach, and for a moment, she simply watched him, noticing the way the soft light from the hallway caught his features, making him look almost contemplative. There was something about him that unsettled her, something unspoken that always seemed to hang between them. But tonight, there was no denying the unspoken bond that had grown between them over the past few weeks. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was real. It was like a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of shared hardship, though they'd never spoken about it. When he turned around, his eyes met hers, and for a second, the world seemed to stand still. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost gentle. It made Yvonne's heart skip a beat, though she couldn't figure out why. "You're still working," Yvonne nodded, though she was too tired to explain herself. "Just finishing up," she said, her voice quiet, worn down by the long hours. Her hands were stiff from the cleaning, her body aching in places she didn't know could hurt, but she pushed the exhaustion aside. She always did. Penley took a few steps toward her, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made Yvonne feel like he could see right through her, like he knew how much she was holding back. "You don't have to stay late. You've done enough today," he said, his words carrying a sincerity she wasn't used to hearing. "You should get some rest. You look like you could use it." She forced a smile, though it was barely there. "I can't," she said, shrugging, as if the weight of her life couldn't be eased by anything other than the next task on her list. "I have to keep moving." Penley's gaze softened, and for the first time, Yvonne saw something other than the calm, composed exterior he usually wore. There was an unspoken understanding in his eyes, a shared recognition of the burdens they both carried. Without saying another word, he stepped back and gestured toward the break room table. "Come on, take a seat for a minute. You deserve a break." Yvonne hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with all of the reasons she couldn't afford to stop, all the things she had to do. But something in his voice, something in the quiet kindness he offered, made her pause. She hadn't allowed herself a moment of peace in so long. Perhaps it was time to take a breath, even if just for a few minutes. She nodded and walked toward the table, sitting down slowly as Penley pulled a chair up across from her. The room was silent for a while, save for the sound of the rain beating against the windows. It was strange, sitting here with him, the two of them alone in the break room, the tension between them palpable but unspoken. Yvonne wanted to ask him why he had been helping her, why he seemed to be watching out for her without asking anything in return. But the words wouldn't come. It felt too personal, too raw. She wasn't ready to confront the emotions that were bubbling to the surface, emotions she had long since buried. As they sat there, Penley's voice broke the silence. "I've been watching you," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, but somehow vulnerable. Yvonne looked up, surprised by his honesty. "I see how hard you work, how much you give, even when you have nothing left. It's inspiring." Yvonne blinked, unsure of how to respond. She didn't feel inspired. She didn't feel strong. She felt like she was barely keeping it together. But there was something about the way Penley said it, the way he looked at her, that made her believe for a moment that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," Penley added, his voice quieter now. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself." The words were like a lifeline, but Yvonne wasn't ready to reach for it. She wasn't ready to let go of the wall she had built around herself. "I'm fine," she said, her voice betraying her. "I don't have any other choice but to keep going." Penley didn't push her, but his eyes held something that made Yvonne feel as though he was waiting for her to open up. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't used to, being seen, being understood without the need for words. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was familiar, like an unspoken bond that neither of them wanted to acknowledge, but both of them felt. Yvonne finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. She didn't know why she was thanking him. Maybe for his kindness, maybe for not giving up on her when everyone else had, or maybe just for seeing her when she had long since stopped seeing herself. Penley gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You don't have to thank me," he replied quietly. "Just take care of yourself, and take care of Lila." Yvonne nodded, though her mind was a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to process. The rain outside was still falling, but it no longer seemed as heavy, as oppressive. For the first time in a long while, Yvonne allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion. Something that felt like hope. Fragile and fleeting, but there, nonetheless. As she got up to leave, Penley walked toward the door, holding it open for her. "Take care of yourself, Yvonne," he said again, his voice soft, almost like a promise. Yvonne looked at him one last time before stepping into the hallway, the rain still pouring outside. But in that moment, she didn't feel quite as alone as she had before. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more. As the door closed behind her, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold and empty as it had seemed. Maybe there were people out there who cared. Maybe there was still a chance for her to find peace. But for now, all she could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, Yvonne allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the past few weeks still hung heavily over Yvonne. She walked into the building the next morning, the familiar cold feeling of exhaustion settling into her bones as she headed toward the supply closet. Each step felt like an effort, but she couldn't afford to stop. She had been working hard for this moment, and even though the tiredness was beginning to feel like part of her, she couldn't let it consume her. As she grabbed the cleaning supplies for the day, her eyes flicked to the clock, noticing that Penley was already walking by. His steps were slower today, more deliberate, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something different in the way he looked at her, something softer, something more understanding than before. Yvonne didn't know what to make of it, but she wasn't ready to ask. It wasn't time, not yet. But as she stood there, the weight of the mop in her hand feeling heavier than usual, she realized that the small, unspoken connection between them had grown into something more. It wasn't just kindness anymore. It was more than that. She didn't know what it was, but it had become undeniable. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to be there when she needed him most, or the small gestures of support that made her feel like someone, just someone, cared. She pushed those thoughts aside, knowing that if she allowed herself to think about it too much, she would lose focus. Today wasn't about the past. It was about the future, and she had a lot to do if she wanted to make it brighter. She couldn't afford distractions. Lila was still recovering, and every day was a step toward a better life for both of them. Later that afternoon, when the sun finally peeked through the clouds, Yvonne took a moment to step outside for some fresh air. She stood at the back of the building, leaning against the cool brick wall, when she heard footsteps approaching. It wasn't Penley this time, but another worker from the office who smiled politely as they walked by. Yvonne returned the smile, but her mind wasn't on the small talk or the fleeting pleasantries. It was on Lila, on the life they were building together. As she walked back into the building, she realized that she hadn't felt this much peace in a long time. That evening, as Yvonne finished her shift, she walked toward the break room to check on Lila. The exhaustion had finally caught up with her, but she didn't care. The sight of her daughter smiling as she played with her stuffed lion made every ache in her body seem insignificant. Lila's health had improved steadily, and now she was playing without the constant worry that had clouded their lives before. Yvonne walked into the break room and knelt beside Lila, brushing the hair from her forehead. "How's my girl doing?" she asked softly, her heart swelling with pride. Lila smiled brightly, her eyes sparkling with a childlike joy that Yvonne hadn't seen in weeks. "I'm feeling better, Mama," she exclaimed, holding up her favorite stuffed animal. "Look, I made him a superhero cape," Yvonne laughed softly, her heart aching in the best way possible. "That's amazing, sweetie," she said, her voice full of affection. "You're so creative," Lila beamed, her little hands clutching the stuffed animal, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to be like you," she said, her voice full of quiet determination. Yvonne felt a lump in her throat. She had been working so hard to provide for her daughter, to make sure that Lila had everything she needed, and yet here she was, still struggling, still fighting. But in that moment, seeing her daughter so full of hope and dreams, Yvonne realized that maybe, just maybe, she was already everything Lila needed. She had fought for this moment, for her daughter, and that was enough. As she kissed Lila's forehead, Yvonne glanced out the window, the rain still falling softly outside. The storm may have passed, but the road ahead was still uncertain. She couldn't see what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was stronger than she had ever been before, and she would do whatever it took to give Lila the life she deserved. The next morning, Yvonne was cleaning the office area again when Penley appeared in the hallway. His presence was no longer a surprise, and Yvonne had grown accustomed to the quiet way he seemed to watch over her. But today, there was something different in the air. There was a weight to his gaze, something that made Yvonne pause for a moment, wondering if this was the moment when everything would finally change. He stopped in front of her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low but steady. "You deserve more than this. You deserve a chance at something better. And I want to help you get there." Yvonne blinked, caught off guard by his words. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she could hear the sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction that made her believe he wasn't just saying empty words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Penley paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her, his expression serious. "I've seen the way you've been working, the way you've been handling everything on your own. You're capable of so much more, Yvonne. I can help you get there. You don't have to do this alone." Yvonne felt a mix of emotions flood through her: surprise, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite put into words. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a daughter to care for, a life to build. She couldn't let herself be distracted. "I appreciate it," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude, but also with a quiet resolve. "But I'm doing this for her, for Lila." "I'll make it work," Penley nodded, his eyes searching hers for a moment longer before he spoke again. "I know you will. But remember, Yvonne, you don't have to do it all alone. You have people who care about you." Yvonne nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. Penley's words echoed in her mind as she returned to her work, the weight of them lingering in the air between them. As the days passed, Yvonne's life began to shift in small but meaningful ways. She continued to work, continued to fight for her daughter's future. But now, she had something more. She had hope. She had the quiet strength of someone who had been through the storm and come out the other side. She had a new family, one that wasn't defined by blood, but by the connections she had built, the support she had found in unexpected places. And as she looked at Lila, her heart full of love, Yvonne knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because, in the end, that was all that mattered. Thank you so much for joining us in this journey with Yvonne and Lila. We hope their story of resilience, hope, and the power of kindness has touched your heart, just as it has ours. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to share your reflections in the comments, and don't forget to let us know where you're listening from. Your feedback means the world to us. Until next time, remember that you're never alone in your struggles, and even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life. Thank you for being a part of this story. See you again soon.